Welcome to Pick Up and Deliver, the podcast where I pick up my audio recorder when I head out for a walk and deliver an episode to you while I stroll around. I'm Brendan Riley. Well, good morning, listeners. It is a crisp, cool day here in suburban Chicago. The weather is in the low 30s Fahrenheit, which would be a couple degrees above 0 Celsius. So nice and chilly. I've got a hat and gloves on today. The sun is out, but it's not shining brightly enough to keep me very warm. That's why I'll keep a brisk pace while I'm talking. We had a nice weekend around the Riley house. Enjoyed some games, one of which I will talk about in an upcoming episode, and generally had a pleasant time as far as these things could go. We did a safe, masked escape room with a family that we're friends with, and had a good time there. We failed to escape by about a minute, which was a bummer. It was especially frustrating because the escape thing we were doing had a sort of bomb element, and the bomb went off at exactly the moment that I solved a puzzle, and so it seemed like the alarm sound we heard was the puzzle, not the bomb going off, and especially because it was like an alarm rather than a booming sound. And then about a minute later, we finished the puzzle. So we failed by about a minute. It was fun. That was actually the first escape room I've ever failed to escape. Bummer. Well, today, I thought I would return to a topic I did a couple weeks ago that got a lot of conversation on Boardgame Geek. And what I thought I'd do is bring in some of the comments from Boardgame Geek and add my own thoughts to them. And that would be the episode. So without further ado, let's jump into the 180-degree rule. As you'll recall, the premise of the previous episode was that there are some things that are just expected in games. When you play a game, you expect that it'll work a certain way. And so I was trying to imagine what elements of the board game have this kind of expectation and which games kind of break those expectations in the same way that some films intentionally break the 180-degree rule to destabilize the audience. There were a lot of really interesting comments, and I apologize to listeners that I don't call out here. I really enjoyed the conversation there, but I don't have time to talk about the whole thing, and frankly, it's not fun to read a whole forum to my audience. So I don't have any direct quotes. I just made some notes and wrote down usernames while I could. So if I miss your username, I apologize in advance. So basically what I'm going to do is point out some other additional comments or elaborations on the 180-degree rules that users called out and add my own two thoughts about them. First response was ubiquitous user Pete, who I always enjoy seeing his contributions. And there were two of the thing, he brought up several points, but there were two that I was particularly struck with. I really liked his idea that games generally assume that you're going to try to win with your full faculties. And he finds it annoying, or he thinks it breaks the game a little bit when games require you to pretend that you don't know things which you do know. In particular, he's talking about games where they have what some people would call limited communication, something like Shadows over Camelot is his example, where you're allowed to say, I can help out a bit here, but you can't say I can help out 4. The example that I've had the most experience with of that type is Gloomhaven, where you're allowed to say generally when you're going to go. I'm going to go early, but you're not supposed to say specifically when you're going to go. I'm going to go 12. And I've always found that a really annoying restriction, just because, again, like Pete says, it is requiring you to pretend you don't know something that you in fact do know. And when the goal of the game is to win, it's weird to be limited in what you can communicate. This also comes out in some cooperative games like Dead of Winter, which each person has a secret goal that you're not allowed to tell anyone. And that secret goal then makes you do things that seem suspicious, which give cover for the traitor to do suspicious things. But if we're all really working together to try to win, then your semi-co-op goal, why not tell people that? I'm obsessed with medicine. I really need to hold on to my medicine. Okay. Like, the idea that we're supposed to be working together to try to win, but I have a secret goal that I can't tell you about that I need to complete if I want to win, gets in the way of us working together to win. It's a core part of what's going on in Dead of Winter, but it is kind of annoying. And then Pete also calls out the inherent problem in semi-cooperative games where everyone could lose, but only one person can win. And this is something that's come out a lot, is this idea that you have to split your time or split your energy then between trying to win for yourself and trying to make sure the whole team doesn't lose. And that's a strange need to have in the game, because the game tells you should want to win. So why should you have to use energy to make people lose? I get what Pete is saying about that being part of the 180-degree rule, but I feel like the win condition is one of those things where it is established with each game. And then again, yeah, there are a lot of people who have real trouble with that result. User Musradis and user AJ Cooper and user Matt Barrett all point out the strange idea of ownership, that in a lot of games, the things in the game belong to a particular player. Now that translates through in a couple ways. Musradis points out the idea of having, like in dudes on a map games, like something like Risk, the dudes on the map belong to a player. For example, in Risk, all of the green colored soldiers belong to the green player. There are some games where individuals don't own the people on the map. Probably the strongest example of this right now, and the one that Musradis points out, is PAX Renaissance, or I think it's PAX Pamir, where what you're trying to do is gain influence with different factions, but you don't actually own any of the factions on the board. For me, I was reminded of the Martin Wallace game Liberté, which I haven't played yet, but has a similar conception, which is you are a noble trying to make it through the French Revolution. You don't actually control any of the troops. You're just trying to wield your influence. This is counterintuitive, of course, because most games that people play do have the idea that you own things. I think that idea is complicated or exacerbated by player colors. User Matt Barrett points out that there are some games where player color isn't the organizing feature for the different pieces, but sometimes it's symbol instead, like in Tigris and Euphrates, where one player will have an ox, I think is one of the faces, and so every piece with an ox on it belongs to the player. And I think there is a counterintuitive part where that, because color is usually the way that we organize things, but I actually find it even more confusing if player color, in which you do own some things, overlaps with resource colors where the resources are not necessarily owned by you, or the board state. Now that I would say is less common, and it's probably more of a graphic design or a presentation flaw than a design choice, like breaking the 180-degree rule. But Bjorn B. and Brendan Slade both point out other games where player color does not necessarily correspond to the things on the board. For instance, in Isle of Cats, as a player, you have a color, and that color matches one of the color of cats on the board, but you don't have any particular ownership over those cats. That your player color is just a color. Now, ideally, I suppose player colors would have been different colors than the colors of cats, but I suspect it was cheaper to just have players take one of the little cats, and that's their color for the scoring. Bjorn B. also points out games where you don't control a thing on the board even when it looks like you should. For instance, the racing game Camel Up. People like to think of racing games as games where you have a thing in a race and you're trying to win the race. In Camel Up, you don't own one of the camels. You are trying to win by betting on all the camels or betting on some of the camels, and none of the camels belongs to you. I don't recall, it's been a long time since I played it, but it feels like you still had a player color. You had like a card that showed you, and that color matched one of the camels. That is confusing. But so the idea that your player color automatically connects to all the things of your color is one of those rules, but I feel like most of the time when that doesn't match up, it's not a design choice, it's a design flaw. Like, for instance, in Camel Up, and again, I may be speaking out of turn, I don't really remember, but I feel like you have a player card that's got a color on it, and that color does match one of the camels. It's weird then that you have no personal stake in that camel unless you choose to. That is counterintuitive. And I wouldn't say counterintuitive in a good way. That's like a bad use of the 180-degree rule. Better to not have a color at all. I think, and that might be true. I may be misremembering Camel Up, and if so, oops. But I know that I have played games like that where you have, Isle of Cats would be an example. In Isle of Cats, you have a player color, but that doesn't give you any personal stake in cats of that color. That's weird and counterintuitive. So I think it's really important that that design choice be adequately reflected in the graphic design of the game to help players make that cognitive leap away from the thing that they assumed would be the case. Another example AJ Cooper pointed out is games where resources don't belong to the players. This is a pretty standard, the idea that you own your resources is a very standard idea in Euro games. Of course, if you play any number of Euro games, when you get a thing, you get it. When you play Agricola and you get a grain, that's your grain. When you get a sheep, it's your sheep. But there are some games where that isn't always the case. The strongest example would be Martin Wallace's Brass or either Brass Lancashire or Brass Birmingham. In both of these games, when you produce a building, it puts resources on it, and those resources represent contracts being fulfilled by your building that you made, right? So if you have an ironworks, you get a couple iron on there, and then when other players need iron, they just take the iron off your ironworks, which sometimes you want them to do because then it flips it and you get points and higher income. Sometimes you don't want them to do that because on your next turn you were planning to use that iron and you didn't have the extra money that you would need to buy the iron from the iron market or whatever. The counterintuitive element there is that we feel like those resources are ours when in fact they're up for grabs. And that part is interesting and intriguing and part of what makes Brass such a cool game, but also so very frustrating. In Brass Lancashire, the most limited, or Brass Birmingham, the limited resources beer. The number of games I've seen where somebody has one of their turns just pooched because someone else uses the beer they were planning to use. Really interesting. But yeah, that is a thing that takes some mental effort, thinking about how do I understand that those resources are not my resource. Serious ? Lee points out that Roads and Boats works in a similar way, that resources just belong to anyone. A guess. I haven't played that one myself. The username SumZero explains that it is counterintuitive that winning and losing isn't always a zero-sum game. I wonder if they just did this as a way to get their username into the conversation. So a zero-sum game, of course, is one where when I do better, you do worse. Chess, for instance, is a zero-sum game. In multiplayer games, or multiplayer still is a two-player. In 3 or plus games, zero-sum has a little bit different meaning, right? Because player A, B, and C, if player A does something that puts them ahead and puts C below, it hasn't affected B. It is still zero-sum, I suppose. But there are other games where they work together. Obviously, semi-co-op games have that effect. CO2 or Australia, where my doing better helps us all and doesn't necessarily result in you losing. But then there are other games where multiple people can win. And I would say this is the big difference from a 180-degree rule game. Most competitive games, only one person can win. And having a game where multiple people can win in a competitive game is very strange. For instance, Cosmic Encounter has a win condition where anybody who gets their 5th colony wins, meaning that you can, on your turn, invite other people into play and then they win alongside you. Often you don't want to do that because you want to be the only winner, but it's a weird choice. Similarly, the game New Angeles, which is on my shelf waiting to be played when someday I get together with a group of people, is really interesting because in that game you have one opponent you're trying to beat. Each opponent has somebody they're trying to finish ahead of, and as long as you finish ahead of that opponent, you win, which means that you can have a sort of cascade of victories in which several people win, which is weird. Most people don't like that. I believe SumZero also pointed out, or this may have been somebody else, the idea that games without tiebreakers And this feels drifting a little bit to me into annoying territory, because it doesn't ruin our ability to play the game. It ruins our ability to find out who won. And I don't think it sort of goes counterintuitive in the same way. We get to the end, we're like, wait, there's no winner? People share a victory? That part feels less brain-breaking to me than some of these other ones we've been talking about. Nonetheless, SumZero did point out games with only one winner are particularly interesting, are the default. And so games that have more than one winner or some complicated win condition. Somebody else pointed out, I did not write down this username, I apologize. Somebody else pointed out another counterintuitive element would be games where the winner is not the person who got the most. That games where, and I don't remember the examples of these, I apologize, but games where if you get the most points you lose, but if you have the second most points you win. Now, there are a number of games that have some sort of secondary resource that you have to watch out for. The Scoundrels of Skullport expansion for Lords of Waterdeep has a corruption element where if you have the most corruption, you get a significant penalty, or maybe you lose automatically or something, and that undermines your ability to win. Or in London, for instance, you accumulate these poverty cubes. If you have the most poverty cubes, you take a big hit to your score. But I don't think that's what they're talking about. I think they're talking about games where you're competing for money, or you're competing for something, and if you end up with the most of that thing you're competing for, you lose, and the person with the second most wins. And I will say, this is a game. There's a game idea that my design partner and I have workshopped quite a bit. We've tested a lot. We have it in sort of blind playtest form. That is exactly that. It is an auction bidding game with a couple simple mechanisms where your goal is to end the game with the second most money. If you have the most money, you lose. So this is certainly something I've experimented with, and it is somewhat counterintuitive. That usually the thing you're trying to get the most, thing you're trying to get should you want the most of if you're trying to win. Well, that's about half of the results that I had from the Boardgame Geek forum. I think at this point I'm going to stop and we'll reconvene on the next episode. You can join the conversation over on Boardgame Geek, either in the forums for Pick Up and Deliver, or in the general forum, just search for the Board Game 180 Degree Rule. Probably on Google we'll find it faster than the Boardgame Geek search. And that would allow you to more easily find that particular conversation as it occurs. You can also find a direct link from the website at rattleboxgames.com, where I post show notes that include things like links to forums on Boardgame Geek. Well, I appreciate you joining me today, and I hope that your next walk is as pleasant as mine was. Bye-bye.
Brought to you by Rattlebox Games.